All right, I'm gonna hit you with the cold hard facts right now. If you don't have 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses sitting in an emergency fund, you've set yourself up for financial pain in the future. In fact, having an emergency fund is one of the most important things you can do for your financial health. In this video, I'm gonna actually share 7 of the main reasons why an emergency fund is so incredibly important. Let's go. All right, reason number 1, and that's peace of mind. There's nothing like having a big pile of cash just sitting in a savings account waiting for something bad to happen in your life so that you can pay cash for it. Whether it's a medical emergency, a sudden flight that you have to take across the country because a family member needs you, whatever it is, maybe it's just your transmission breaking in your car's breaking down and you need to pay $3,000. Whatever it is, having money sitting in a savings account provides you with a ton of peace of mind. And if you have 3 to 6 months worth of that, you have a lot of peace of mind. I mean, think about it. If you lose your job, what are you going to do for 3 months? What are you going to do if it takes you 6 months to find a new job? You need some money stocked away so that you can afford your life, so that you don't end up getting evicted from your rental, so you don't end up getting foreclosed on with your house, whatever it is. Having a big pile of cash creates a ton of peace of mind. It's so important. So there you go, reason number 1. Reason number 2 is protecting your assets. So if you have equity in a home or you own your home outright, if you have a 401k, if you have just investments in mutual funds or whatever it is, anything that's an asset in your life, anything that's of monetary value that you own, if you have money put into an emergency fund and an emergency fund happens, you can pay for the emergency fund rather than having to dip into something like your 401k to pay for it, or dip into, pull money out of mutual funds or sell your car or even sell your house to pay for the emergency. If you have an emergency fund, you're protecting everything that you own. So go set one up. All right, reason number 3, avoiding debt. This sort of plays into the same thing in the last one. If you have an emergency that occurs and you don't have money to pay for it, you're gonna have to pay for it in some way. Like, for instance, a medical bill. Right? Hospitals are more than willing to put you on a payment plan because they want their money, but it locks you into months and months and months of reduced cash flow, and it's debt. It's debt. It might not be interest. It might not have any interest tied to it, but it is debt. It's money that you owe over the course of time. And if you just have money sitting in a savings account for you to pay cash, then you don't have to worry about that. So avoiding debt is a great benefit and one of the most important reasons to have an emergency fund. All right, number 4. Having an emergency fund helps you gain financial confidence. There's just this stress and anxiety and sort of timidness that comes with not having money in a savings account to pay for an emergency fund. There's just that stress. I think we all know about that stress, but if you have money sitting there, you've got a big pile of cash, you have the confidence to do things that you might not necessarily do without it. For instance, let's say you have $30,000 sitting in a savings account and you hate your job. Well, with $30,000, it's a lot easier to quit that job and go find something new. It's a lot easier to justify that move. If you don't have any money sitting in a savings account, then it's hard to have the confidence to quit that job and go find something new because you rely on that paycheck. You're relying on the very next paycheck in order to make ends meet. If you have a big emergency fund, you don't have to worry about that. Granted, quitting your job shouldn't necessarily be an emergency. Maybe you just save up something beyond an emergency fund for that. But that's just a good example of a moment where if you have an emergency fund, it gives you financial confidence to do things that you wouldn't otherwise do without a big pile of savings. Number 5, having an emergency fund lowers your risk. The thing I always think about is the more money you have, the less financial risk you have. And so it makes sense that building an emergency fund just reduces your risk, whether that's the risk of losing your job, whether that's the risk of something like a major worldwide pandemic happening. I think we can all relate to that right now. But if you have money sitting in an emergency fund, your financial risk just goes down. The more money you have, the less financial risk you have. Because think about it like this. If something bad occurs in your life and you have a ton of money to pay for it, you don't have to worry. There's not a lot of risk there. If you have no money, there's a lot of risk. So having an emergency fund lowers your financial risk, plain and simple. I know I've said that. I sound like a broken record in this little reason here, but yeah. It lowers your financial risk. Reason number 6, having an emergency fund actually can help improve your relationships. Now, I'm not a relationship coach. I don't have a PhD in psychology or whatever it is that, whoever talks about relationships. I'm not Dr. Phil, but I can tell you from personal experience that if you have a big pile of savings sitting in an account, it's easier on your relationships and in particular, your marriage. Because if you're not relying on that next paycheck to make ends meet, or you don't have to worry about a big major medical bill occurring in your life and and figuring out how to pay for it, there's just a reduced stress. You'll get in fewer fights with your wife, you'll be less stressed, so maybe you fight less with your kids. It just improves your relationships. I can tell you from personal experience. And on a more personal note, I can tell you that having an emergency fund is really beneficial to all the relationships in your life. For instance, just recently, my wife and I had a baby, and our baby had some complications and ended up in the NICU for a little while. And we have a nice big emergency fund worth a little more than 6 months of our living expenses. And we didn't have to worry in that moment about how we were going to pay for those medical bills. In fact, we had saved up over the course of my wife's pregnancy, we had saved up a significant amount more than our emergency fund. And so we didn't even have to dip into our emergency fund just because we know how important it is to have that money stocked away. We decided to pile up a big bunch of cash more. But in the moment where we were dealing with the stress and anxiety and trauma of what we were going through with our daughter struggling in the NICU, one thing I can tell you that we weren't worried about was the money side of things. And that was because we worked really hard to prepare for something. We didn't even know what we were preparing for, but we prepared for it. And in that moment, we were both very grateful. In fact, when we came home from the hospital, it was something that we actually discussed. Like, hey, can you imagine if this had occurred 4 years ago? For us, we weren't even married at that time, but had we had a major medical expense like that occur 4 years in either of our lives, that would have been a much different situation. We would have been stressed about the medical situation and the bills that were coming. And in the moment, just recently, just a few months ago, we didn't have to worry about the financial side of things. And I can tell you, it's a giant breath of fresh air, because in that moment, it's the last thing you really want to be thinking about. All you want to be thinking about is the individual that you're caring about, whether it's your daughter, whether it's your spouse, whether it's any kind of family member or whatever. If you can just be worried about them and not the finances behind it, I can't tell you how much weight that lifts off of you. So start saving an emergency fund. It's that important. All right, and reason number 7, I know I got a little deep in that last one, but reason number 7 is a little bit more lighthearted, and it's having an emergency fund teaches you financial discipline. If you can learn to put money into savings and leave it there in an emergency fund, then that's setting you up for some really good success when it comes time to start investing your money. Because if you can leave money that's really liquid, that's really accessible, and not touch it and just keep it there for an emergency fund, then how easy is it going to be when you start putting money into your 401k or Roth IRA or mutual funds or whatever investments you choose to invest in? It's just going to be so much easier if you've already practiced, if you already have that training ground of the emergency fund that has taught you financial discipline. It's something that I've never really heard anybody talk about when it comes to an emergency fund. But speaking from personal experience, I used to be a very financially undisciplined person. And saving that emergency fund, between getting out of debt and saving an emergency fund, I learned a lot of financial discipline, both my wife and I did, and it has served us really, really well. I can't tell you how good of a training ground saving an emergency fund is. It's just so important. So there you have it, the 7 reasons why saving an emergency fund is incredibly important. Go open a bank account. I recommend opening a bank account at a separate bank account than you have your checking account, so that you can put it there and you don't see it every time you log in to check your expenses. But just go start putting money into an emergency fund, start preparing, because something is going to happen in your future. Just like what happened to my wife and I with our daughter. I hope it's nothing like that for you. I hope it's nothing serious. Maybe it's just something like a blown tire or a broken down engine with your car. But having that emergency fund is such a beneficial thing. It's such a weight off of your life, and it's going to make your financial health so much stronger. So go set one up, save as best you can, make it a priority. Oh, and by the way, hit that like button, watch a couple of these other videos. And if you really like this video, don't be afraid to subscribe, but go watch a couple of these other videos first.